Hey everybody, this is Jim with Song Tripping. I've been meaning to do this video for a while, and I've been wanting to talk about John Wesley Harding by Bob Dylan, his late 1960s album, after he made his retreat post motorcycle accident. Nobody knew what he was up to, really. And then he came out with this gem, John Wesley Harding. And in particular, I'm interested in exploring what digital version might be the best version to listen to. Of course, that's a completely subjective question, and your ears will have to tell the difference there. But I did want to do a bit of a shootout, which is appropriate because John Wesley Harding, the man that Bob Dylan based his song on, was something of a gunslinger, wasn't he? So John Wesley Harding marked a turn in Bob Dylan's career. It was recorded, as I said, on the other side of his motorcycle accident while he was living in relative obscurity. And this is post Highway 61 Revisited, post Blonde on Blonde. And the sound on this album is dialed back, stripped down to a core trio. Dylan on acoustic guitar and sometimes piano, Charlie McCoy on bass, and Kenny Buttrey on the drum kit. And as I said, a few songs add Dylan on acoustic piano, and Pete Drake appears on steel guitar on one or two tracks. This album really paved the way for Dylan's country and western phase, which will come to full flower on Nashville Skyline. And it also overlaps with the time period in which he was recording the basement tapes with the band. The songs on this album are like little parables, character songs, gnomic parables. And one sense is that Dylan has just pulled off the highway and taken a dirt road to some point of prominence and isolation, where he can take stock of the 60s, the era he's grown up in as an artist, an era that's spinning out of control, and he's looking at it from something of a safe distance. Sort of an outlaw move, an outsider move, a rejection of the bleeding edge. And in its own way, it's a revolutionary album in the way that it peels back things to the core. So as I said, Bob Dylan on vocal, guitar, harmonica, and piano, Charlie McCoy on bass, Kenny Buttrey on drums, Pete Drake on steel guitar on the tracks I'll Be Your Baby Tonight and Down Along the Cove. Engineering by Charlie Bragg, produced by Bob Johnston, who did almost all of Dylan's 60s albums, if not all of them. So anyway, I want to compare mostly digital versions, but let me give you a word about the vinyl. So this is my vinyl copy, the label, Columbia 2i stereo 360 sound. And my vinyl copy is not the best. It's not a great pressing. What does it have in its favor? Well, it has the warm, fuzzy feel of vinyl. Charlie McCoy's bass really thumps and punches through the mix. The bass throughout the album is just phenomenal. In a lot of ways, Charlie McCoy is the featured instrumentalist on this album. His bass playing is just melodic and just front and center. And that sounds good on the vinyl. Dylan's harmonica is tamed because of the warm fuzzies of vinyl. A little bit less shrill than you'll find in some of the digital versions. And I would guess that it had been EQ'd a little bit to sound good on vinyl. Now, what are the cons of the vinyl version? Some adjectives that come to mind with regard to this mix that are less flattering. Well, it's muddy, it's muffled, it's veiled, the mid-range feels scooped out, Dylan's guitar is buried. I hear the percussiveness of his strumming, but very little of the sonority and the tonality. The drums sound muffled. The piano parts are really buried in the mix. So aside from the bass, like everything else seems to suffer. My overall assessment of the vinyl version is it's cozy but too fuzzy. Now, you might find a better pressing of this album. I don't want to diss the vinyl, and I wouldn't get rid of this. I like having the full-size cover and everything. And thankfully, the harmonica has been tamed, because that's been a big criticism of this album, is the shrillness of the harmonica. But you can hear Dylan's plosives from singing too closely into the mic. He's like, those puh sounds. And I noticed this especially on the Frankie Lee song. The bass and drums interplay is the highlight of the album on the vinyl, musically so, but the bass dominates too much of the mix. And again, I just want to put the caveat in here. It could be just simply that I don't have the best pressing on vinyl of this album. So my recommendation for vinyl is it's certainly worth having it, like the OG vinyl. If you're a collector, you want the nostalgia value, you're a Dylan completist. But you're probably going to want to turn to the digital versions for a more rewarding experience. So let me move right along and cue up the original stereo release of this album. Just give me a moment to set this up. And what you're going to find here is some interesting results. Okay. On the original stereo release, so also this album was released in stereo and vinyl. Okay, but this is the original stereo CD release, and so much is improved here versus the vinyl. In every category, it sounds better. The EQ is more balanced. Dylan's guitar tone is seems to be pushed up in the mix. McCoy's bass is still front and center as it should be, but it doesn't overwhelm anymore. The drums are clearer, the drums are punchier, nothing's really been buried in the mix, and you hear every musical move that these guys are making. Listen, for example, to Kenny Buttrey's kick drum foot pedal work on All Along the Watchtower, how he pushes the beat forward. You can just hear how tightly in sync the bass and drums are on tracks like that. So the original stereo release is pretty good. Pretty good. We'll come back to it. So that was, I think, the first version I had was the original stereo release on CD. Well, the vinyl was my very first. Now, I want to turn to the Sony SACD stereo release. So here is in the early 2000s, they released a bunch of Dylan on SACD, which was a new format, an audiophile format. And here's how this sounds to my ears. The Sony SACD mastering is brighter than the stereo CD, the original. Very clear, lots of presence, more grain and grit. Dylan's voice seems more prominent, or very prominent. The harmonica does sound harsher, though. It's more piercing on some songs more than others. Wicked Messenger, I'm Looking at You. Wow, is it shrill on that one. The acoustic guitar has percussiveness and sonority. It sounds higher definition than the older stereo CD I just showed you, and it gives you the impression that you're listening to a studio tape. You can sort of hear the tape rolling almost. Most of this is a good thing, but there are moments of harshness here. And in a headphone listen, it's a bit of a fatiguing listen. It's louder, it's harsher, it's more fatiguing. I thought it sounded much better through speakers than through the headphones. And I don't want to slag this version too much. It's good. And there is also a sweetness here that you get more of here than on other versions of the album. So the stereo SACD is the original SACD from the early 2000s. Pretty nice. Okay. Now, next up, I'd like to turn to the original mono recordings box version. And I got this a few years back. It was on sale, and I'm glad I picked it up. So here are all the 60s Dylan albums, mono versions. And you can see here they replicated the 2i mono label. How does this sound in comparison to the other versions? Well, this brings up the question, does John Wesley Harding sound better in mono than in stereo? And that's a tough one, it really is. To an extent, it depends on the song you're listening to. The title track, John Wesley Harding, in my humble opinion, is much better in stereo. As I Went Out One Morning sounds pretty good in mono. Some tracks, it seems to me, the drums get lost in the mix on mono, and you're never going to lose the bass on any version of this album. It always is going to sound fat and thick in a good way. The acoustic guitar feels maybe better in mono than in stereo, less likely to get lost in the mix. Dylan's vocal sits on top very clearly, and like the stereo SACD, the harmonica is tamer, which reminds me of the original stereo CD. So unlike the SACD, the harmonica seems to be tamed a bit, which reminds me of that original stereo version. The harmonica seems better blended, less piercing. All that being said, the fact that in the mono the instruments seem to be smashed in the midfield, I miss the separation of the drums in the right channel and the acoustic guitar in the left channel in the stereo mix. And if you take some of the piano-based songs like Dear Landlord, it's there in the mono, but it's in danger of getting washed out by that flood-filling bass that just fills up the whole spectrum. It does hold its own though. So same goes for the drums. There's sort of a risk of it getting sort of buried a little bit in the mono, but it holds up. And then in many songs, all the instruments sort of sit in their own pocket and they find a home. In other songs, they lose some presence that I think is to be found in the stereo versions. Lonesome Hobo on this version, I thought sounded great in mono. So it's a bit of a mixed bag when you go stereo to mono. And I don't have a mono vinyl to compare vinyl versions to. So it's sort of whatever your taste is. I mean, they both sound good. It's just, it's open to debate, which is better. Let's take a look at Mobile Fidelity here. This is the Mobile Fidelity SACD mono version. I think they also did a stereo version. I don't have that. I don't plan on getting it. But interesting results on the Mobile Fidelity. So, wow, the first song, the title track, John Wesley Harding, I thought it sounded really garbled with the guitar. It's kind of an abomination. It seems like the EQ has been futzed with. There's just no clarity on the drums. And the Sony mono that I just showed you, this one, clearly superior to the Mobile Fidelity mono, in my opinion. This was almost unlistenable. Now, that's for the first track. When we get to As I Went Out One Morning, it's much better. But then wait, it sounded like there was a tape dropout after the first verse. And I just can't believe that they used an original master tape for this source. And if they did, it's been degraded with age. I don't know what happened, but to my ears, something is a bit amiss. Now, the bass does sound excellent. It's well-rounded, and yet it's bounded. It also sounds like The engineers here made an attempt to tame the harmonica, but I'm really not overall pleased with the EQ sources so much. The acoustic guitar just sounds sandpapery to me, and this is an effect that only comes across occasionally on the other versions I shared with you. The ring and the tonality of the guitar I thought was much better on the Sony stereo SACD and on the Sony mono CD. And also, if you have multiple versions, compare the track I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine. Of all the CD versions I have, this one sounds the most like the vinyl. This one here sounds the most like the vinyl in its lackluster warmth, like in a bad way warm. Usually warmth is a plus for me, but it can have a downside, meaning you lose presence, sort of too much of a sludgy sound. So I guess if you want the most vinyl sounding digital version without actually owning the vinyl, you might consider the Mobile Fidelity, a mono SACD. I have heard people seem to prefer the Mobile Fidelity stereo SACD over the mono, but I can't vouch for that. I haven't heard it. And I sure hope they didn't introduce noise into their mastering chain when they did this album, because I just fear something is a little bit off with it. Now, I should add that some songs sound fine on this version. I'll Be Your Baby Tonight comes to mind. It's got a nice tight bass and very well-rounded ensemble feel. So, in the final analysis, here are some tips. For what it's worth, again, like you can only be the judge. It's your ears, your subjectivity, your equipment, and so forth. But I would, for what it's worth, here's my 2 cents. I would avoid the Mobile Fidelity Mono SACD. The vinyl is good for collection value, but I didn't think it had the best fidelity. But it's just like apples and oranges when you're going vinyl to CD. The original release stereo CD, I think, is the best value, and it just might be the best sounding, believe it or not. Despite all the remasterings and all the fancy SACD technology and all that, the original stereo CD, which you can find in the bargain bins, I'm sure, sounds pretty darn good. The Sony 2003 stereo SACD is the brightest and has the most presence, but it verges on harshness in spots. The Sony box set version from here, the mono, it's excellent. But I didn't think all the songs sounded best in mono. So you sort of, that's why you have to go back, I think, to the original stereo CD if you like those mixes. So in my final rankings, for what it's worth, I thought the best version was the original stereo CD, believe it or not, the best overall value. In second place, the Sony mono CD and the stereo SACD are tied. They're for different reasons. So I think, it's just, what are you going to do? It's a bit of a push there. In third place would be the original vinyl because it has vintage value and I like the full-size artwork. And in last place is the Mobile Fidelity Mono SACD. I didn't think it was any better than the Sony Mono CD. The Sony is clearly better. And it's just unnecessary as a result, unless you don't want the box set. Granted, you're going to have to fork out probably about $100 to get the whole box set. But you might want to check out the Mobile Fidelity stereo version, which I did not listen to. So that's my John Wesley Harding shootout. Let me know what you think of the different versions of John Wesley Harding. If I missed anything, you have different opinions, or you want to just sort of validate what I was saying, I'd love to hear what your comments are. Leave a comment. Hope you subscribe and ring the notification bell, and hope to see you soon on song tripping. Thanks.